In the summer of 1942, German staff officers studied their maps in a village headquarters west of the Don River. The front that had nearly collapsed during the winter now appeared stable once more. Fresh arrows pushed deep into southern Russia. The retreat from Moscow was over. The initiative, it seemed, had returned. But one name on the map carried more weight than all the others: Rostov-on-Don. The gateway to the Caucasus, the city the Germans had seized in 1941 and then been forced to abandon in their first major retreat of the war. This time, the order was explicit. Rostov would be taken again, and it would not be given up. What no one in that room yet understood was this: once German troops crossed the Don at Rostov, Hitler would make a decision that split his armies, stretched his logistics, and opened the road to Stalingrad. In late 1941, Rostov had already been a scar. After the spectacular encirclements at Kiev and the advance across the steppe, 1st Panzer Army under Ewald von Kleist had driven on Rostov in November. They took the city on the 21st, only to be smashed days later by a Soviet counterattack from the north and east. The 37th Army of the Soviet Southern Front hit their exposed flanks and threatened to cut off Kleist's spearheads. Under that pressure, Field Marshal Rundstedt ordered a retreat to the Meuse River line. Hitler raged, briefly sacked him, then had to accept the reality on the ground. It was the first time the Wehrmacht had given up a major city it had just captured, the first time a German field marshal had refused to hold at all costs. For the Soviets, Rostov 1941 was a badly needed morale boost, proof that the Wehrmacht could be beaten and pushed back. For the Germans, it became a grudge. When planners drew up the summer 1942 offensive, Case Blue, Rostov was again circled in red ink. This time, they told themselves, there would be no repeat of 1941. By spring 1942, the Eastern Front had changed. The failed drive on Moscow and the winter counteroffensives had cost Germany dearly. Infantry divisions were under strength, panzer losses had been heavy, and the front line had wobbled alarmingly. But it had not broken. Hitler needed a way to regain the initiative, and he needed fuel. The plan he approved as Case Blue was ambitious even by Barbarossa standards. Army Group South would deliver the knockout. The first phase would smash Soviet forces around Kharkov and Voronezh. The second would surge to the Don and Volga. The final phase would drive south into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields at Maykop, Grozny, and eventually Baku. German oil stocks were dwindling. Without new sources, the war of movement would grind to a halt. Rostov sat at the hinge between these ambitions. Physically, it controlled the main rail and road crossings over the Don River into the Caucasus. Strategically, once Rostov fell, Hitler could unleash his armies south toward the mountains and east toward the Volga. It was not just a city, it was a doorway. Case Blue opened on June 28, 1942 with a familiar sight: German panzers bursting through thin Soviet lines. The 4th Panzer Army and 2nd Army lunged toward Voronezh. Farther south, 6th Army battered Soviet formations around Kharkov, then began its drive toward the Volga. Behind them, Soviet armies were reeling, under strength, and often poorly coordinated. But the phase that mattered for Rostov was Blau 3, the southern swing. Here, 1st Panzer Army again played the point role with 17th Army on its right and 4th Romanian Army on its left. Their job: break through to the lower Don, capture Rostov, and then fan out into the Caucasus. If they moved fast enough, they might trap large Soviet forces of the Southern Front against the Sea of Azov and the Don. Across the river, the Soviets knew what was coming. The 56th Army and other units of the Southern Front were already under enormous pressure. The winter successes around Rostov had not turned into a decisive shift. Instead, the front had been worn down by continuous fighting. When the German summer offensive gathered speed, Soviet commanders faced a grim choice: stand and risk encirclement, or retreat and surrender key territory, including Rostov itself. They chose to trade space for time, but time was exactly what the Germans were trying to deny them. The approaches to Rostov were brutal country for an army on the run. To the west lay the Meuse River with its low ridges and deep gullies. Beyond that stretched the open steppe, baking in summer heat, dusty, dotted with villages and thin shelter belts. It was terrain that rewarded speed and punished hesitation. German panzer columns, with their long reach and integrated air support, thrived here if fuel and maintenance held. Soviet units withdrawing across this landscape risked being cut to pieces from the flanks or overrun from behind. By mid-July, Kleist's 1st Panzer Army had already driven some 250 miles from its starting line. The German spearheads were now turning southeast, aiming straight for Rostov. The 17th Army advanced more directly from the west, moving on a narrower front. In theory, the two would meet around the city, trapping the 56th Army against the river. The Battle of Rostov 1942 formally opened on July 19th. In practice, it was less a set-piece assault and more a race. German formations racing to seal a pocket, Soviet troops racing to escape it. On the German side, everything that had gone wrong in 1941 seemed, at first, to be going right. The weather was good. The ground was dry. The Luftwaffe, particularly Sturzkampf Geschwader 77 with its Ju-87 Stukas, enjoyed local air superiority and pounded Soviet columns on the roads around Rostov and along the Don crossings. As German formations closed in, the Soviets tried to blow bridges and dikes, planning to flood the marshes south of Rostov and slow the attackers. But this time, the Germans had prepared something special: Brandenburgers. The Brandenburg Regiment was a special forces formation, trained in infiltration, demolition, and operating in enemy uniforms. In the early hours of the assault, Brandenburger detachments crossed the Don in rubber boats, slipped through Soviet positions, and attacked key crossing points: the Bataysk Bridge and the dike to the south of the city. In fierce, close-range fighting, they seized parts of the structures before Soviet engineers could complete their demolitions or open the floodgates. German engineers rushed in behind them, working under fire to secure and repair the crossings. Those bridges became the throat through which the offensive flowed. With the Don crossings intact and the marshes unflooded, Kleist could push tanks and motorized infantry over the river far faster than the Soviets had expected. The 56th Army, already in retreat, suddenly found German units appearing on its flanks and rear, not just in front of it. What might have been an orderly pullback toward the Caucasus threatened to turn into a rout. Inside Rostov itself, the situation deteriorated quickly. For the civilians, this was déjà vu. They had seen German troops enter the city in 1941 amid scenes of chaos and fear, then watched the Red Army retake it days later in brutal street fighting. Now, less than a year later, the front had rolled back again. Soviet authorities hurried to evacuate factories, remove anything useful to the enemy, and burn what they could not move. Refugees clogged the streets. Workers, families, wounded men on carts. For the soldiers of 56th Army, Rostov was no fortress. It was a choke point they had to pass through. Orders stressed withdrawal, not heroic last stands. But even a retreat through a city under air attack and artillery fire becomes a battle, whether you want it or not. German artillery, brought up by the 17th Army, began to pound key junctions and rail yards. Stukas hit barge crossings and ferry slips along the Don. German advance guards probed into outer suburbs, testing resistance, marking Soviet firing points. Behind them, flak guns were dragged forward, ready to double as anti-tank and street fighting weapons once the time came. On July 23, 1942, after 5 days of fighting and pursuit, German troops entered Rostov in strength. This time there was no powerful Soviet counteroffensive poised to strike from the north. The Red Army was busy falling back toward the Caucasus and the lower Volga, trying to form new lines before the Germans could catch up. By July 24th, the battle was effectively over. Rostov had fallen again, this time without the sting in the tail of 1941. For the German troops, it felt like vindication. For Hitler, it felt like proof. Because for Hitler, the fall of Rostov was not just another victory. It was confirmation that his grand design was working. On July 23, 1942, the very day Rostov was recaptured, he issued Führer Directive No. 45. With that document, he took what had been Army Group South and split it into two. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would drive through the newly opened Rostov Gateway into the Caucasus. Army Group B, under Maximilian von Wakes, would push along the Don toward the Volga and seize the city that soon everyone would know, Stalingrad. In other words, once Rostov fell, Hitler decided he could have everything at once: the oil fields to keep the war going, and the symbolic industrial prize on the Volga. On paper, it looked brilliant. In reality, it broke the logic of his own offensive. The problem was not that taking Rostov had been easy. The problem was that it looked easy. The Soviet 56th Army had avoided encirclement by retreating rather than standing and dying in place. The city fell in 5 days. The crossings had been snatched intact by daring commandos. Compared to the meat grinder of Moscow or the winter battles around Rzhev, Rostov 1942 felt almost clean, an elegant operational success, the kind that had made the Wehrmacht's reputation in 1940–41. Hitler drew the wrong conclusion. Instead of seeing a Red Army that had chosen to trade space for time, he saw an enemy on the verge of collapse. Instead of concentrating his forces for one decisive blow, either on the Caucasus or on the Volga, he now ordered them to diverge, driving on both objectives simultaneously. Splitting Army Group South into A and B created three critical problems. First, logistics. The supply system in southern Russia was already stretched. Rail lines had different gauges, bridges were bottlenecks, and truck parks were short of fuel and spare parts. Now, instead of feeding one main axis of advance, the Germans had to support two, heading in different directions, one south into mountainous terrain, the other east along the Don. Second, command and coordination. With two army groups operating on diverging paths, the gap between them widened. If the Soviets recovered enough strength to strike into that gap, they could cut the German front in two. The hinge of that whole structure, the place where any encirclement would close, was exactly where the rivers and rail lines crossed, around Rostov and the lower Don. Third, ambition versus resources. Case Blue had been drawn up with sequential phases in mind. Blau 1, then Blau 2, then Blau 3. Hitler's Directive No. 45 turned that into a simultaneous wish list. Both major goals, oil and the Volga, had to be reached quickly before the Soviets could regroup. But the forces available were not enough to guarantee success along both axes if the Red Army fought hard. None of these weaknesses was obvious on the map in late July. Rostov had fallen, Voronezh had been taken, Soviet armies were in retreat. The summer sun was shining on a string of German victories. The warning lights, if anyone saw them, were easy to ignore. From Rostov, Army Group A surged south. Panzer columns crossed the Don and fanned out along a 200-kilometer front, heading toward the Caucasus. They captured Maykop's shattered oil fields in early August and pushed as far as Elista and the foothills of the High Caucasus by autumn. It was the Wehrmacht's deepest penetration into the Soviet Union, a spectacular advance on maps and newsreels. At the same time, Army Group B drove along the Don Bend toward Stalingrad. There, the offensive gradually bogged down into a brutal, attritional struggle amid ruins and factories. The Sixth Army found itself chewing house by house through a city that Hitler now insisted must be taken no matter the cost. As the summer turned to autumn, the weaknesses created at Rostov came home to roost. The farther Army Group A advanced into the Caucasus, the longer and more fragile its supply lines became. Everything, fuel, ammunition, food, had to flow through the Rostov bottleneck and then across hundreds of kilometers of poor roads and strained railways. Meanwhile, Army Group B, locked in the hell of Stalingrad, sucked in more and more units and supplies just to stay in the fight. When the Red Army finally unleashed Operation Uranus in November 1942, smashing through the exposed Romanian and Italian armies on the Don flanks and encircling the 6th Army in Stalingrad, it was not just that one city that was threatened. Follow-on offensives, Operation Little Saturn and others, aimed at something bigger, cutting off Army Group A in the Caucasus by driving toward Rostov. If the Soviets could seize the Don crossings in the Rostov area, the entire German force in the Caucasus, hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and guns, would be stranded with their backs to the mountains and the Black Sea. Suddenly, the gate that had seemed to open so easily in July 1942 looked like a trapdoor. In late December, Hitler finally faced the reality his generals had warned about. As Soviet spearheads pushed west and south from the Stalingrad pocket, threatening the communications hub at Rostov, he ordered Army Group A to begin withdrawing from the Caucasus. What had been a triumphant advance now became a scramble back over the same roads and passes, abandoning hard-won territory to avoid encirclement. Rostov once again became a choke point, this time for a retreat. Columns of trucks, tanks, horse-drawn artillery, and refugees clogged the routes north. Fuel shortages and Soviet air attacks turned the withdrawal into a nightmare. German commanders rushed to keep the Rostov corridor open long enough for Army Group A to escape. They succeeded, but only just. The price was the abandonment of the Caucasus adventure and the impending catastrophe at Stalingrad, where the 6th Army was left to its fate. In a sense, the Germans spent the winter of 1942 to 43 undoing what they had done since the fall of Rostov. That is why the 5-day Battle of Rostov in July 1942, often treated as a footnote to Case Blue, deserves its own spotlight. Tactically, it was a clean German win, a well-executed pursuit, clever use of special forces to secure key crossings, and a successful forcing of the Don line. The Soviet 56th Army escaped but lost a crucial city and gateway, retreating deeper toward the Caucasus. Operationally and strategically, though, Rostov 1942 was the hinge. It restored German pride after the embarrassment of the 1941 retreat. It seemed to prove that the Red Army was still incapable of stopping a well-planned German offensive. And it triggered Hitler's decision to split his main force, overextend himself, and chase two objectives with resources barely sufficient for one. From the moment German troops stood on the Don bridges at Rostov and looked south and east, the map of 1942 contained the outline of 1943. The road to the Caucasus and the road to Stalingrad both ran through that city. Once Hitler tried to march down both at the same time, the seeds of disaster were sown. If you zoom out and trace the arcs of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad is the headline, the catastrophe everyone remembers. But just behind it, slightly in the shadow, sits Rostov-on-Don, the doorway that opened so easily in July 1942 that Hitler, for a fatal moment, believed every other door in the Soviet Union would fall just as fast.